Good evening, blog viewers. Hope everyone is staying cool. It's almost hit 100 degrees out here, so I'm sure it's warm everywhere else as well. Today we're going to focus on an excellent set of essays by Harry G. Frankfurt in his book, The Importance of What We Care About. And the essays we're going to focus on today are just a few in this book: Freedom of the Will and the Concept of a Person, The Importance of What We Care About, and his essay, Identification and Wholeheartedness. But before we turn to Frankfurt, I want to make some preliminary comments about some of the issues that Frankfurt's book involves. And I think generally the issue that's going to dominate this post is sort of the modern dilemma for modern man. And I think for me, that dilemma is becoming clearer, that this dilemma is the fact, on the one hand, of a temporally finite creature, man, existing within an infinite world of potential good and potential experiences. On the one hand, with respect to temporal finiteness, it's undisputed that each human life begins with birth and ends with non-existence. Those are the borders. And in between those two borders, you have conscious life. You're conscious of being alive. You're conscious of your experiences. You're conscious of what's going on around you at all times, even during sleep in some ways. And that is life. And of course, the seat of human consciousness is the brain and the mind. And with non-existence, then what happens is the brain does not get at some point. The brain stops getting a supply of blood, and the brain, within 8 to 10 seconds of not getting blood, becomes unconscious, and within 40 to 110 seconds of not receiving blood, it becomes it has no ability to control your reflexes any longer. And so at that point you have human non-existence. You have a non-consciousness in the brain and non-existence. So that is, on the one hand, the temporal finiteness, which is undisputed. No one could deny any of those comments on the basis of evidence. And so there is no evidence of human consciousness in the form of life as we now experiencing it after non-existence occurs. No evidence of that. But on the other hand, there is an infinite world of good, as we've discussed in many of the posts, an infinite world of experiences for man to pursue, many of which are good. And these infinity of experiences and goods can either occur as a spectator or as a participant. And sort of the modern age has seen proliferation of these things, and there's very little evidence that it's going to curtail or stop. It's probably going to continue to multiply. As a spectator, there is an infinity of books one can read. There are an infinity of travel destinations one can go and see. There are an infinity of websites one can peruse. There are an infinity of TV programs, movies, or sporting events one can watch. There are an infinity of restaurants one could, or near infinity for all these things. Basically, essentially infinity. The numbers get so large that it's basically the same thing. An infinity of restaurants one can go to, an infinity of arts and museums one can go to in the world, an infinity of music one can listen to. All these experiences as a spectator. As a participant, largely an infinity of experiences as well. As an active participant, an infinity of work one can engage in, an infinity of sports one can devote oneself to, an infinity of hobbies to pursue, an infinity of friendships that one can try to cultivate, although that's complicated by the fact that the friendships to have any sort of substance and depth, that requires time. So I think that's probably a little bit a harder case. Romance, the same. There's obviously you can pursue various romantic forays, but again, the depth of each one is usually proportional to the amount of time and attention you devote to it. And parenting, of course, there's an infinity of ways to parent and activities that you can engage in with respect to parenting. So in all this, you see an infinity of good and infinity of experiences for a temporarily finite creature. And as you age, and I think as you develop, you and start to accumulate some of these experiences, you start to have recurring desires to engage in all of these different activities. And I think that's undisputed. Very few people get up every day and have the desire to do nothing, nothing whatsoever. They usually moved in one way or the other to pursue one of these different things. And so the question is, the big question is, should you simply satisfy your desires as they pop up in your brain, as you sort of get some notion to do something, or pulled in one way or direction, or one direction or the other toward one of these things, or should you have some sort of plan or strategy to satisfy these desires, or to give certain, even if it's a very, very broad plan or very broad sort of distinguishing criteria to determine which desires get preference at any point, which desires should be most attended to, which things should be least attended to and less engaged in. And so that is, I think, a large portion of what Frankfurt's book is concerned with. And I think he does that, and he hits upon all these issues, many of these issues, by distinguishing and making a distinction, a verbal distinction, which he concedes is hard to actually find in reality, but it is an abstraction that's useful in some ways. And that is between what he labels a wanton creature, W-A-N-T-O-N, versus a person. And a wanton creature for Frankfurt is one that pursues varying desires as they simply arise in the brain. When there is a conflict of desires, the wanton just goes with whatever desire is strongest at the time, whichever desire he's more pushed to. The wanton is not concerned in any way with evaluating different desires to determine which desires actually deserve or merit taking center stage or taking priority in one's life. There's not any sort of that evaluative activity happening in the wanton. The wanton doesn't evaluate whether it's good for himself to be motivated by his desires in the way that he is. It's in the strength to the strength with which he is, and why he's motivated for one set of desires rather than the infinity of potential other desires he could have at any point. And I think you see that at page 16 of this book, where Frankfurt writes, the essential characteristics of a wanton is that he does not care about his will. His desires move him to do certain things, without its being true of him either that he wants to be moved by these desires or that he prefers to be moved by other desires. He ignores the question of what his will is to be. Not only does he pursue whatever course of action he's most strongly inclined to pursue, but he does not care which of his inclinations is the strongest. This sort of person is contrasted very significantly by Frankfurt with the person. And it's interesting that in that section, in that sentence ended with the wanton not caring which of his inclinations is the strongest, because that is in fact for Frankfurt, for the person, that is the number one thing that distinguishes him. Though the person deeply cares about which sort of desires should get precedence in determining various conflicts between desires and which actions to pursue. The person favors one set of desires over the others because he identifies himself and he cares very deeply with viewing himself as being attached to one set of desires over the other. And the person gets this from a sort of self-reflective activity where he thinks about and evaluates which sorts of desires he wishes or he thinks is best to associate himself with. And in not only does he make those kinds of decisions, but those decisions are backed by sort of a full resolve or earnestness to actually live in accordance with that kind of decision, to actually pursue those desires rather than other sets of desires, and to make that sort of a dominant focus of one's life, the pursuit of those desires rather than some other set of desires. Person and Frankfurt stresses that in this decision-making activity, in this caring about one set of desires over the other, in this earnestness and this resolve to carry forward on one set of desires rather than the other, the person literally creates and forges his identity in this process. This is for Frankfurt sort of the constitution or the creation of the self, based on these highly significant decisions as to which sorts of desires to pursue. And you see that at page 170, where Frankfurt writes, this is as to the person. The decision which desires to favor determines what the person really wants by making the desire on which he decides fully his own. To the extent the person, in making a decision by which he identifies with a desire, the person, in making a decision by which he identifies with the desire, constitutes himself. It comes to be a desire that is incorporated into him by virtue of the fact that he has it by his own will. But even if a person is not responsible for the fact that the desire occurs, there is an important sense in which he takes responsibility for having the fact of having the desire. The fact that the desire is in the fullest sense his, that it constitutes what he really wants when he identifies himself with it. Through his action in deciding, he is responsible for the fact that the desire has become his own in a way in which it was not unequivocally his own before. So this activity is actually one in which the person looks at his varying desires, identifies a set of desires that he wants to identify himself very strongly with, and literally almost whether the desire was consciously created by himself or sort of from an external source sort of implanted in him, he makes the desire his own. He identifies with it. He basically constitutes it as himself and constitutes it as part of his decision-making apparatus, and it literally becomes internal at that point. When this happens, Frankfurt is clear to stress that it's not that the other desires are not there now. The other sorts of conflicting desires, or the desires that sort of lost out, are not there. They're still there, but something has happened in the person that has decided to affiliate with one set of desires over the other. And you get that here at 173 when Frankfurt writes, when the body heals itself, it eliminates conflicts in which one physical process, say infection, interferes with others and undermines the homeostasis or equilibrium in which health consists. A person who makes up his mind also seeks thereby to overcome or to supersede a condition of inner division and to make himself into an integrated whole. But he may accomplish this without actually eliminating the desires that conflict with those on which he has decided, so long as he disassociates himself from them. And so that the key concept there is disassociation. The desires, the conflicting desires might still be there. They still might exist. The person doesn't really have control over the fact that those desires sort of happen to pop in the brain once in a while and sort of suggest an avenue of action, but they're disassociated from. They're not pursued. They're certainly not amplified and intensified, but they are gradually, and I think Frankfurt found the perfect word there, they're basically disassociated. They're not made, they are made a lesser and lesser portion of the human personality, the human mind, and the decision and the values of the person than they previously were, while still, again, not entirely, quote, vanishing from the person. Now, I'm going to take a drink of water here, and it's really hot. Okay, now Frankfurter sees the person and not the wanton as being the one who actually attains true freedom, true lasting freedom, despite the fact, importantly, that he's no longer free just to follow any passing desire. That was the wanton. The person is not following any passing desire, has sort of curtailed his sort of infinite freedom in some ways, but for Frankfurter, he's felt Frankfurter, this person is actually more free. And you get that in the last passage I'm going to read here on page 174, where he talks about the concept of deliberation. This is the function of deliberation, which is designed to increase the likelihood that decisions will be good ones. Hobbes suggests that the word deliberation connotes an activity in which freedom is lost. It is, after all, deliberation. This may seem paradoxical, since we customarily regard deliberation as paradigmatically connected to the exercise of autonomy. The difficulty disappears when we recognize that the liberty with which deliberation interferes is not that of the autonomous agent, but that of someone who blindly follows impulse, in other words, of the wanton. A person who is deliberating about what to do is seeking an alternative to doing what comes naturally. His aim is to replace the liberty of anarchic, impulsive behavior with the autonomy of being under his own control. And that sort of perfectly sums up, again, I think, Frankfurt's distinction between the wanton and the person. Now, I have three dominant reactions to Frankfurt's ideas here that I want to go through, probably the first being the most important. And I think this is a point that Frankfurt doesn't bring out, which really does need to be incorporated into the discussion. And that is whether it's better for someone to be a wanton or a person, whether that ideal is better for a human being in actual life, within actual reality, not within the context of Frankfurt's book, not within the concepts of the human mind, but within the context of life within reality. Whether one or the other framework is better is dependent on the situation, and depends on the circumstances of the person's life within that moment, within reality. And it's not a all or nothing. It's not an absolute statement in the way that Frankfurt wants it to be. And you can see this, I think, pretty quickly and pretty easily once you go through some scenarios, which I'll have 5 of them here I want to go through. And in each one, ask yourself whether you'd rather be hanging out or being with someone or associate with someone in that situation that's a wanton or person. The first one would be a bunch of college students on a spring break trip. Now, obviously, provided you're not drinking and driving, you're not violating the laws, you'd rather be with sort of someone that's more wanton. You want to be with someone that's following different desires and impulses and just having a good time and trying different things out. No big deal. Everyone does that. It's not anything to be called into question or made problematic. It's part of the experience of being with college students on spring break, and you want to be with people, I think, that are more wanton in that situation. Again, that would be the more fun trip. How about second situation, weekend days, when there's very little to do? Slow time of the year, not much going on in your life. Let's say weekend days and the dog days of summer. I think you'd probably rather be more of a wanton then. You'd rather kind of just try out some different things, go with varying impulses, try different stuff out. There's nothing wrong with that either. You might just try a hodgepodge of different activities that you haven't tried before, just based on whatever strikes your fancy that day. Now, what about you're nearing the deadline, you're involved with a group of people at work, you're on a group project, and you're nearing the deadline of that project. I think obviously you want to be with people that are persons at that point. You want to be with people that are reliable, that know the criticalness of this project getting done correctly, and you don't want to be with anyone that's, in that case, a wanton that would just leave as the deadline was approaching to go have a drink with a buddy somewhere. So that in that case, you'd obviously rather be with persons. What about a marriage? Now you can. Now I think the situation's getting even easier to see. You obviously want to be with a person. Your marriage has to be, I think, for a good marriage, has to be one of the dominant, if not the dominant criteria, not the dominant criterion of how you structure and give weight to your varying desires for different activities and experiences. And that needs to be a process that you engage in reflectively. You can't just be following any impulse. I don't think that those kinds of marriages can work very long. Now, what about parenting? Same thing. You can't just decide to go to Hawaii for a 1-month cycling trip if that's going to interfere with your childcare responsibilities. So you must be present, I think. One of the key aspects of parenting is being present in many different senses for the child. Being emotionally present, being physically present, paying attention, foreseeing certain problems that the child may not see himself. And all that requires time, and all that requires that the activity of parenting occupy a pretty dominant place in your set of desires. You can't be sort of neutral or as to parenting versus all the other things you want to do. You have to have that be a dominant. If you have kids, if you don't, then it's not an issue. But if you have kids, then it needs to be one of the dominant frameworks of your life that judges and will likely usually win out over many other desires. And so again, I think whether being a wanton or person is better is not a one and done deal, but for the rest of your life. But again, it depends on different situations. The second reaction I had is a point that Frankfurter is silent on, and he talks about disassociating from certain desires, and I think he talks about drug use, and his examples are related to drug use. But I think that's an easy case, and I think you need a better metric. You need a metric to determine which set of conflicting desires you want to disassociate from, because for people that aren't drug users, that's not even a problem. So how do you do that? What is the metric you would use to decide which desires to disassociate from and which desires to give priority? And I think for me, it always comes back to whether a certain activity for a certain person, unique in each case, is becoming a closed infinite loop, is becoming a sort of habitual activity, repetitive, in which the person is not generating good, is generating a form of nothingness, and is not progressing in any way in the activity. There's no deepening of thought. There's no deepening of experience. There's just sort of the same things done and the same thoughts and the same things being endlessly, infinitely looped, and without the production of good. And I think any activity, drugs is certainly one of them, but gambling, smoking, drinking, and almost any form of addictive activity of varying forms can start to resemble that kind of activity, and those should be ones that I think deserve to be disassociated from. Finally, I think certain goods really do require a tremendous time commitment and effort, and the attainment of certain goods. And I think for this, but I think despite requiring that, I think they can radically reorient a person's life for the good in many good ways. But it requires, again, the sacrifice and time commitment, and giving that sort of activity pride of place or center stage in your activities. And I think it's good for Frankfurt to stress that. And stress the importance of having sort of this second order. He calls it a second order volitional, kind of a complicated term, but basically the notion that you would want to associate, and you have decided to associate yourself strongly with one set of desires over another, and you act in ways that really reflect that point. And I think that is a good way to attain a certain things that do require a lot of effort. Marriage, parenting are the good examples. And if you have that commitment, which is, you don't have to, but if you want that, and if you want those things to be good, and I think Frankfurt's analysis of having and deciding for yourself and really wholeheartedly wanting these things in the way that a person rather than a wanton wants it is important, because again, the wanton may want marriage, he may want to be a good parent, but he wants a million other things. And because he's neutral as to that thing versus anything else, Frankfurt stresses this: when the chips are down, when things are not going so well for the person's not going to have the commitment to that thing that requires the commitment. In the same way that the person, in a different way than which the person who had worked out, who had strongly identified himself with that desire, would be able to persevere and would be able to get through that point. And I think that is really ultimately the value of Frankfurt's distinction in these two concepts. So with that, I'll end this post, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.